All right, we're in week 4 of our Skinny Santa series. If you have been following along, and hopefully you have, the first week we talked about how Santa had given money to 3 young ladies so that they would not get sold as ladies of the night, or so that they would not starve. And we learned the importance of not only just giving gifts to people, but giving gifts that can change their lives and help save them in the long run. In week 2, we saw Santa stand up for some sailors who were almost put to death because they were falsely accused of some ruckus. And we learned that we need to have a sense of urgency when it comes to helping meet people's needs. That people have needs that need to be helped now, especially when it comes to salvation. People need to know who Jesus is without us waiting. In the third sermon from last week, we talked about how Santa challenged some sea-bearing ships to provide some of the grain that they had so that they can help provide the region around where Nicholas was. They were suffering a famine, and he challenged them to step out in faith, give some of the grain, and provide for these people who are starving, and God will provide for you. And we learn the importance of stepping out in faith, that we might not know exactly how God is going to accomplish what he's going to accomplish. We might not see the plan that he has in store, but when we step out in faith, he will provide for us and he will make it all work out. So we are at week 4, and we need yet another volunteer to help us open up the stocking that will help us to bring to light today's topic. So we are not going to pick a boy because, unfortunately, last week I didn't think. We've already picked 2 boys, so we picked 3 boys, and that's not a good idea. We don't want to give in to gender inequality, and so we're going to pick a girl this time. So, sorry, Ryder, Blake. So anyhow, so go ahead and put your hands down. On the count of 3, I will just pick a name. 1, 2. Are there any? I don't. Okay. On 3, I'm going to, have you girls throw up your arms, and whoever gets it first. 1, 2, 3. And I'm not going to pick Lena because she's my daughter. So, Audrey, you win. Yep. I don't want them to get a sense of entitlement because they're my kids. All right, come on, Audrey. I want you to pick through this and tell me what you think has to do with today's story. Just pull it out. Don't be afraid. It's not going to bite you.
Santa's nose?
Yep. Okay. Keep going. No, hold it. The whole thing is you have to juggle all this stuff. All right.
Reese's peanut butter cups. And a sloppy hand and a pen.
Okay, and then here's some more candy. All right, so which of those things do you think has to do with Santa today?
The candy.
No, you're wrong. It's the sloppy hand and the pen. Now, you can keep the sloppy hand. I expect you to use it on John later. Sloppy hand and a pen. I'll keep the pen, though, because I need that. So here you go. Take that. And here's a Snickers you dropped there. Okay. Sloppy hand and a pen. What in the world does that have to do with Santa? Well, it ties into the bumper that you saw where Santa was lifting weights. There was an event, a myth, a legend that was attached to Nicholas about 1,000 years or so after these events took place, and it has to do with some physical violence. So let's go ahead and watch this video and see what these things have to do with Santa.
We've all written letters to Santa before, but have you ever heard about the letters that he wrote? What was on Santa's wish list? In the year 325, Santa, who was also known as Nick, was invited to participate in one of the most important gatherings in all of history, the Council of Nicaea. It was at this conference that Christians affirmed the teaching that Jesus is God and wrote a set of beliefs that is still upheld today. However, a few of the people didn't agree with the teachings about Jesus. This is where it gets interesting. Because one rumor said that Santa got so mad that someone was teaching the wrong things about Jesus that he leapt up, ran across the room, and smacked the man across the face. But that never really happened. It was just a legend that was made up about 1,000 years after the council. But here's what really happened. Rather than using his hands for harm, Santa used his hands for good. After the council was over, Santa wrote several letters to the people who disagreed with the decisions, pleading with them to agree with the teachings about Jesus. Rather than getting angry, Santa was patient with the men and pleaded with them to agree. And for at least 2 of the men, the letters worked. A few years later, they completely affirmed these beliefs about Jesus and were completely restored by the church. What was on Santa's wish list? That these men would know the one true God. And that's our wish for you, that you would know and follow Jesus. He is the one who Santa followed, and he can be the one that you follow too.
So that's an interesting story. We would love to, and we saw it twice. It's an interesting story, the legend of Nicholas smacking the other theologian that he disagreed with. That myth was probably made up because we're not satisfied with some nerdy dude writing down a letter to somebody. That's not as fun as smacking him upside the face because he's teaching the wrong things about Jesus. But it is a good story nonetheless, because what he actually did in writing letters to some of these guys to convince them of the truth was a powerful and bold thing to do, which led at least 2 of them back to a right knowledge of who Jesus is. And it wasn't a minor dispute that they were discussing either. It was a major disagreement about who Jesus is. Is he fully God, or is he something like God? So the understanding rightfully who Jesus is very important. And that's why we have this whole Christmas season. It's why we celebrate the birth of Jesus, so that we can more fully understand who he is and what he came to accomplish. Today we're going to be looking at a passage in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And in this, John is going to be telling the Christmas story from a different angle. You're not going to see the manger or the shepherds or the angels, but we're going to see some really awesome stuff. And we're going to learn some really interesting things about Jesus that will give us reasons to celebrate. And the things that John talks about here are some of the very things that they were arguing about at the Council of Nicaea. So I don't want this to be an exercise of boring theology. This is really important truths. These are really important truths about Jesus that ought to get us excited. More excited than the gifts, more excited than the dinners that y'all are going to have to fatten you up a little bit more. This is really important stuff. So we're going to begin looking at verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about the light. Now, John here is using a fancy name for Jesus that has a lot of baggage theologically with both Jews and Greeks. That this term, the Word, when you look at the historical context, there was a lot of weight going on. And John just opens up his gospel by talking about this Word. And there are many similarities to how he begins with how we see the beginning of Genesis, as God in the beginning was God, and God created everything. And you see the parallels between Genesis and this. And so John doesn't tell us that he's talking about Jesus. In fact, he makes a little note here that he's not talking about John the Baptist, that people thought that he was perhaps some mighty figure that was going to come and help the people. But he wasn't the light. He wasn't the Word. There was somebody else who is the Word. And we know that he is talking about Jesus. And when he's talking about the word here, he's talking about, like I said, there's some Hebrew and Greek things going on in the background that are giving some weight to this idea. A word, we can kind of equate it to being truth and wisdom. Because the Greeks were concerned very much about truth and about philosophy and understanding properly how things work. And the Hebrews, the Jews, were really concerned about wisdom. That was one of the things that they sought after. They almost talked about wisdom as if it was a deity of itself, but it was one of the facets of God that they really looked forward to and honored. And that's why we have the book of Proverbs. This is a collection of Hebrew wisdom because it was so important to them. And so John is just dropping this concept, this word, this truth, this wisdom, and he says, look, this thing, this word, this thing is part of God. It's not just something that God created. It's not a byproduct of God's creative aspect. It is God himself. It's not like God. It's not similar to God. It is God himself. The word is God. And this is the debate that was happening at the Council of Nicaea. Is Jesus actually God, or is he something like God? And so we know that here he's talking about Jesus. Jesus is the Word. He is the wisdom, the truth of God. He is that creative force by which all of creation was created. When you hear that God spoke and the universe existed, that is Jesus creating. But not only is he the Word, but he is also, John tells us, that Jesus is the light. So we can celebrate because Jesus is the light that shone in the darkness. When he's talking about darkness and light, he's using that as a metaphor. Darkness is talking about despair or oppression, doubt, or the sins that we struggle with, discouragement, separation from God, being ignorant of God's truth, or those things that we struggle with that cause us to question, is God really here? Does God really love me? And yet God shines in the darkness to give us hope in all of these things that we struggle with, that God is present with us, and because of that we can have hope. So that is one reason to celebrate. Let's continue reading in verse 9. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. So he tells us very plainly that Jesus is the creator of all. And yet he chose to enter into creation to rescue us from our sin. And we can celebrate because the creator stepped into his own creation. This is an amazing thing that he, being God, being infinite, being all-powerful, all-knowing, greater than all of the existence, was able to squeeze himself into a little baby and dwell amongst us, to live as a human among us. This was a great act of humility and vulnerability because he didn't come as a king. He was the king. As the wise men come to visit Jesus later, as he is a toddler, not as a baby, they recognize that he is the king of the Jews. He is rightfully born as a king in the line of David, and they give him gifts that are fitting a king. But he didn't come as a king. He came to be born to a normal family, a working class family who struggled at times to make ends meet, that they made just enough to get by and didn't have a whole lot extra for extravagance. So he didn't decide to be born into a great wealthy family or one with great prestige or political clout, but to a young lady and her betrothed husband. And as he did so, he had all the same human weaknesses that we had. He had the same vulnerabilities that we had. Even as a baby, he was extremely fragile, like all babies are. He was absolutely dependent on the care of Mary and Joseph. And we know that he was so fragile that even Herod the king was trying to kill him because he was seen as a political threat. So God didn't send him in bubble wrap and he didn't send him in some protective shell, but he sent him in the most vulnerable way that he could, to be born and to endure all the things that we as humans endure. He experienced a normal childhood. Even those awkward, teenage, rebellious, obnoxious years, Jesus still went through all of that like all of us do. And John tells us a sad fact that even though he was the creator, even though his fingerprints are all over creation, even though all of us have this desire, this longing to know who God is, that even as he came, people did not recognize who he was, the creator taking on flesh, that the world did not recognize him, even though he was the one who spoke them into existence. And he was rejected by his people. He was put through a torturous death. Yet he did this because of his great love and commitment to us. He did this to rescue us from our sins. And then he brings it a step further in verse 14 where he says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus came to the earth. He didn't just come and he could have taken on whatever form that he wanted to, but he came as a human and he lived among us. Now, the word here that he is using isn't just like he lived in the area. It's not like he walked around with us. It's not like he bought a house down the street. The word that he is using is one that means to pitch a tent. That Jesus set up a tent and he dwelt in that tent among humanity. That doesn't seem like a huge deal. But John is taking on some language and some baggage from the Old Testament, where he instructed the people after he'd set them free from their bondage in Egypt. He says, I want you to build this elaborate tent. And I'm going to be with you in this tent. There's going to be this special place, the Holy of Holies, that I'm going to put my presence so that you can draw near to me. You can be in close proximity. I will be your God. You will be my people. And you can come and be really close to me. You can see my presence. And you can come and worship and hang out and be among and be around my presence. And so this idea, and this is the same kind of word that John is using, that God, through Jesus, has set up a tent to be among his people. He wants to be close. He wants to have this close proximity. He wants to have a relationship with all people. He wants us to draw near to him and him draw near to us. And this is why he came, so that he can take that which separates us from him. He wants to take away our sin so that barrier, the valley that separates us from God can be removed so that we can draw near to him. So we can rejoice because the word made its home among us. And to the people in John's day, this would have been an absolutely crazy thought, because drawing near to the presence of God was not something everyday people could do. Yes, they could get pretty close back when they had the tabernacle, but there was still a courtyard and there were places that they could not go. And when they had the temple, there were a certain distance that they could get to, but they could not get really close to God. There was only one person who could get close to God to enter the Holy of Holies, and that was the high priest on the Day of Atonement, once a year. So it wasn't something that everybody and anybody could do, to be in the direct presence of God, or at least not be in the presence of God and live. And so for Jesus to be God, to take on flesh, he removed that barrier that separated us from him. There was no longer this veil. There were no longer walls and courtyards and priests and sacrifices standing in our way. People could look at him face to face. They could see his glory without dying on the spot. This was absolutely transformative in the history of humanity, where there was no longer this barrier between us and God, because he chose to come and live among us. And so John, the apostles, the crowds, the religious leaders, all those who gathered to experience his miracles and teaching saw his glory. They saw his grace. They saw his truth. And even his apostles, they got a special glimpse when they were on this mountain. Jesus, his appearance transfigured amongst them, where he took on more of a heavenly appearance. And even they got to see his glory without dying. So God is beginning to do something new. And what is really awesome about that is that those who have put their faith and their trust in Jesus, they have accepted his salvation, that God sends the Holy Spirit to dwell in us as the temple, so that God is even closer than face to face, that he is integrating with our souls and interacting with us on a soul level. And that is absolutely something that the people of his day, they were absolutely unprepared for. But Jesus didn't just come and move into our neighborhood to hang out. He didn't come and just chill with his fam. He came not just to give us a book of rules, but he came to model living in a way that we honor God and we love our neighbor. He came to show us what it looks like to love God with all that we have and all that we are, and to love our neighbor as ourself. It wasn't just God dictating from heaven, you must do this. God took on flesh and he showed us how to do it. He showed that it was possible to live to honor God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if you want to know how to do it, imitate the way of Jesus. So he didn't come to just tell us what to do, but he came to show us how to do it, and gave us promises that he is here with us to help us accomplish that. And so we are to model his example of grace, truth, the way that he served people, the way that he helped people who were in need, the way that he welcomed children into his midst, and chastise those who would say, keep the kids away. And so we want to do good, but not for goodness sake. We want to do good because that is what Jesus did. He came to do good towards others, to help other people out. And this whole series really hasn't been about Santa. It hasn't been about cutting back so that we can help, just so we can cut back and have more in our bank and have more time. But we have been learning about Jesus. We have been learning about helping those who are in need just like he helped us. And we have been especially mindful that we need to be helping those who are most vulnerable, including children, who there are millions of people, children who are homeless in this world. There are millions of children who are struggling with poverty and broken homes and abuse, and where their parents are addicted to drugs, or where there is divorce, or maybe the kids don't know who their father is. There's so much dysfunction in this world, and our children are taking the brunt of all of that dysfunction. And their lives are being destroyed as a result. And so we have been challenged to do something about that. And yes, we have been using the story of Santa to kick things off, but it's all about Jesus and what he came to accomplish and what he is calling all of us to do in response. And so to put feet on all of what we have been talking about, to make it more practical so that it's not just a mental exercise, so it's not just an exercise in proper theology, which are all important. But we want to do something about what we have been talking about. So we have been giving this Skinny Santa challenge, which is consisting of 3 parts. the first part is that we share Skinny, that we tell the story of Santa before he got to the North Pole, because the way that he lived in the early 300s and the challenges that he put himself in the midst of, the people that he went to bat for, the people that he helped, the people that he served, these are awesome stories that are so much better, so much more powerful than being able to deliver millions of presents in one night. And so there's this website, skinnysanta.org, where you can find some talking points that you can have discussions with your kids, your grandkids, or whoever, and also some small group discussion questions so that you can have a discussion with adults. The second challenge that we offered was to go skinny. And I know it's a little bit late. This is Christmas Eve, and some of y'all, I know you still have some Christmas shopping to get done. You're really bad at procrastinating, so maybe you can there's still hope for you to do this. But we challenge you to go skinny, to cut back on some of your spending, cut back on some of the things that you are devoting your time to, and take some of those resources that you are saving to use it to do something good. To sacrifice and to tell your kids, look, we're going to cut back a little bit, and because we want to help people who are in need. And we really gave two options for that. The first option, which was really the secondary option, was if you see a family who is in need, some kids who are in need this year, that maybe you could take that money and give it to them, put it in the envelope and give it to them. Because you might want to keep it local. Maybe you know this family is really struggling and your heart is really going out to them. You really care for their kids. You can help them out during this Christmas season. And if that's where money wants to go to, just write it on the envelope, help a family in need, and we'll make sure that we can get it to a family who is in need. But the other way, the primary thing that we have been emphasizing is, hey Maggie, you're here, is that Maggie is involved with this awesome ministry where they can help take kids on a temporary basis, where they're displaced by all sorts of crises, and she can take care of them and take them into her home, but she needs some money to do that. So we have been saying, look, we're going to pool all of our money, and we're going to make sure that she can get it when she needs it. And so we as a congregation will take care of managing that money and making sure that she gets what she needs. So we're going to pool that and take what we collect and help her to help kids who are in great need. The third challenge was to live skinny. Because we recognize that as we start talking about these things at Christmas time, many of you have already done your shopping. Many of you are already stubborn and say, I'm going to spend this amount of money or whatever it is. You know, you've already set, the plans are already made, the presents are already bought, things are already in motion. But you recognize that you want to do something. You want to help children on an ongoing basis because that is what God wants us to do. He doesn't just want us to throw a check in an offering plate once. He wants us to use our time and our resources and our finances and all that we have to help kids who are in need, especially kids. And so I would challenge you to continue to seek out opportunities to help kids who are in need. Find ways that you can mentor kids. I'm sure you can talk to Adam Cheeseman over there at the board office, and he can get you in contact with kids who need some mentoring or some tutoring or some help. They need somebody to come alongside them as they are experiencing trouble in their lives. We also say that there are opportunities for you to sponsor a child that you can every month give out of your resources to help a kid. We support Hippo Valley Christian Mission, which they have several child sponsorship programs in Africa to help kids over there. There's Compassion International, all sorts of other groups that do similar things. So find a way to not just let this be something we talk about on Christmas, but something where we intentionally put our efforts towards helping kids who are in need. Now I want to close this out by sharing a story of an awesome family where they took these ideas. This happened long before this was even thought up. But they saw opportunities to help a child in need, and God was able to bless them and bless so many people because of it. So I want to share you their story. And forgive me, I'm going to read it. I do not want to mess this up. It's their story, and it's an awesome story. It's about some people that we met when we were in Lincoln, Illinois. We attended this church, Jefferson Street Christian Church. This guy, Phil, was a greeter at the door, and his wife, Angela. They're both really awesome servants, and we'll learn about their story here. So have you ever thought about how much you could change the life of a child if you simply chose to live skinny on an ongoing basis? We never know how much of an impact we can have at the time we make the decision, but we can learn from others who have made that decision in the past. And here's a story of a couple who did. Phil and Angela Rogers were missionaries serving in what is now Congo. They were serving there back in the 1990s. Many of you have heard of or watched the movie Hotel Rwanda. It's about a genocide that happened that took the lives of approximately 800,000 people in only 100 days. To put that in perspective, even though it was during a short duration of time, there were six times as many people killed during this genocide as there were during the Holocaust. The pace at which people were being killed was unfathomable. So there were literally bodies everywhere with no one to bury them. Parents were murdered, and elementary-aged children were forced to take care of their infant siblings. Many of the children who lived were badly mutilated. Phil and Angela lived across the river from the Rwandan border. When the genocide broke out, the Rogers, along with other missionaries, started serving the refugees coming across the border. Now, these refugees were literally being shot at from both sides, by those who were trying to run them out of Rwanda and by those who were trying to keep them out of the Congo. So as Phil and Angela started ministering to the refugees, God laid it upon their hearts for them to start praying about how they could help just one refugee in need on a permanent basis. Just like we have been challenging you through the Skinny Santa Challenge to think about how you can help children on a permanent basis. So they started to pray this prayer sometime in June of 1994. But there's another part of Phil and Angela's story that you need to know. Phil was in the very early stages of a horrible disease known as Huntington's disease. It is known to slowly take a person's neurological abilities, but it leaves their mind intact. Now, Phil and Angela had two daughters, and they wanted a son, but they knew that Huntington's is primarily passed down through the male gene, and that's where God stepped in. Little did they know that on the road out of Rwanda, there was a mother fleeing the country along with her children. Her husband had been murdered, and she was pregnant while trying to escape. She went into labor, and in sometime of June of 1994, she gave birth to a little boy, whom she named Mose, or it's French, so I can't pronounce it, which is French for Moses. Sadly, she died of cholera, and all of her children, except for one daughter and the newborn baby, died of cholera as well. But God was working, and his people were praying. The surviving daughter rescued her newborn brother and took him to the Congo, where his life was saved. Some missionaries caught wind of his miraculous story, and on August 1st, just 2 months after the baby was born, and Phil and Angela started praying, God connected their story. Phil and Angela adopted this miracle baby boy and fittingly kept his name Moses. So Moses was rescued from death and given life because two people chose to permanently help a child in need. Just a couple of years after Moses was born, Phil's condition deteriorated to the point where he had to return home from the mission field, where they returned to Lincoln, Illinois. And there they spent the next 20 years. Moses steadily grew, and Phil's health slowly eroded. And finally, in August of 2017, Phil Rogers died at the age of 59. But the spring before he died, he was able to celebrate his son Moses as he graduated as a Bill Gates Millennium Scholar from the University of Illinois. And word has gotten out that he has the opportunity with that same fund to go on to get his master's degree. And all this because two people were willing to pray and tell God that they were willing to help a child in need. So let me ask this. Who do you think was more blessed, Phil or Moses? I think it's a toss-up. They were both blessed in such wonderful and miraculous ways, infinitely beyond what we can imagine. And so I challenge you, will you help somebody become the next Moses? But there's a question that we really need to ask before we get to that step, and that is, will you pray the prayer that Phil and Angela prayed? That God's give us a child that we can help. Send someone. Give us an opportunity to help a child on a permanent basis. And when you pray that prayer, when you're offering to help a child in need on an ongoing basis, whether it's mentoring, whether it's child sponsorship, or helping with adoption or foster care, you may be very well taking that child from death to life. You are going to change their life for eternity. You can help change them from a life of deadly decisions to a life of decisions for God, from a life of poverty to a life of plenty, from a life of darkness to a life lived in the light. And so as we reflect this Christmas on the truth that Jesus stepped down into heaven so that he could lift us up, I ask, would you be willing to help a child in need on an ongoing basis by stepping down so that you can lift them up? By sacrificing so that they would have what they need? And by sharing your love so that they might experience God's love.